It's Father Vogel. We have been going through this series on St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life, and today's video we reach the final chapter of the first part of his book. Through this first chapter, St. Francis de Sales introduces us to the devout life, why we should pursue it, and the things necessary in order to do so. We also went a little bit into chapter 2 already and learned his method of meditation, and then returned back to chapter 1 and learned and then actually went through the 10 meditations. And these last chapters, as this part ends, has us consider that not only are we to seek to be purified, cleansed from our mortal sins, but also from venial sins, specifically the affection or attachment to venial sins, as well as even to not be attached to useless or dangerous things that in and of themselves may not necessarily be bad, but for us can draw us away from God, take our attention away from Him. And so finally, in this last chapter of this first part of his book, he says that we must also cleanse ourselves from what he calls evil inclinations. And so what these are our natural inclinations, our natural dispositions, tendencies that we may have that are defects, are not necessarily good. And he says these aren't, what he's talking about are not necessarily sins in of themselves, though they might be our natural tendencies that could lend us to being susceptible to sins in certain areas. So let me read some examples of what he gives so we can better understand this. So he says, he gives an example that St. Jerome gives about St. Paula. He says that she had such a great inclination to sadness and regret that at the death of her children and husband, she was in danger of dying with grief. He says this was an imperfection, not a sin, because she had it against her will. So she didn't desire to have that reaction, but that was her natural emotional reaction to what was occur, that it would affect her so deeply that it would almost cause her to become ill and even in danger of death. So he gives some more examples. He says there are some people who are naturally cheerful, while others are of a morose temper. Some are of an obstinate disposition. Others are inclined to indignation. Some are prone to anger, others to love. In short, there are few in whom we may not observe some of these imperfections. So this is what he notices, is that we have our tendencies, natural tendencies, whether they've developed over time or maybe that's just part of our disposition. We can't necessarily recognize any kind of specific origin to them. But let's just take one of them, for example. He says, some are prone to anger. Well, anger as an emotion in of itself is not bad. It just is. We all get mad. We all get angry about things. But he says if we have a disposition that tends us toward becoming mad and are becoming so angry that we begin to lash out in ways that are sinful, then that leads us to the deadly sin of anger or wrath. So this tendency to have a short temper or quick, where the initial emotion itself is not a sin, it can very easily lead us to sin, and so it is a kind of defect within us. And so these are the kinds of things that we may notice within ourselves that we want to work on, that we want to change. And so he says that even though they are peculiar and natural to each of us, so each of us have certain specific things, by care and a contrary affection, we may not only correct and moderate them, but even altogether purge and free ourselves from them. So he's really talking about growing in some of these natural virtues. And so as we go through the rest of the book, these are some of the things he's going to help us grow in, is some of the virtues, as opposed to certain whether they're vices or these kinds of inclinations that can lead us in the wrong direction. So he says, there is no nature, though never so good, which may not be perverted to evil by vicious habits. There is no disposition, though never so perverse, that may not, by the grace of God and our own industry, be brought under control and overcome. So when it comes to following God in the devout life, what our current tendencies are doesn't really matter. We need to subject ourselves to Christ and his power. So even the most perfect natural dispositions, he said, can be led astray and can become perverted through sin. But the ones who struggle the most with some of the natural virtues can certainly be purified and can learn to work against them and grow in virtue. The following parts to his book, the chapters, he's going to give us assistance to be able to purify ourselves from these kinds of natural or these dispositions or faults that we may have, as well as from any attachments to useless or dangerous things, as well as the attachments that we may have to venial sins, and of course sins that would be worse than that, the mortal sins as well. So this concludes his first part of his book. We'll continue in the next video, continuing with the second part, where we left off after we learned his method of meditation. God bless.